They destroyed her presentation in front of the entire department, calling her ideas amateur hour, while the CEO watched. Sarah thought her career was over. Her own teammates threw her under the bus for their own mistakes. But what they didn't know was that her quiet husband sitting in the back row wasn't just any ordinary man. What happened next will shock you. Sarah Thompson had always been the type of person who preferred working behind the scenes. At 32, she had spent the last 8 years at Morrison & Associates, a mid-sized marketing firm in downtown Seattle, quietly building campaigns that generated millions in revenue for their clients. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She wasn't the loudest voice in meetings or the one who took credit during presentations, but everyone knew that Sarah's research was thorough, her strategies sound, and her execution flawless. Her cubicle sat in the middle of the creative department, surrounded by colleagues who had somehow convinced themselves that volume equaled value and confidence trumped competence. Sarah's desk was organized and minimal, decorated only with a small succulent plant and a framed photo of her and her husband David from their wedding day 5 years ago. The picture showed them laughing on a beach in Hawaii, both dressed simply, looking genuinely happy rather than posed for perfection. David worked from home as a freelance consultant, or at least that's what Sarah told her colleagues when they occasionally asked. He was quiet, thoughtful, and seemed content to let Sarah be the breadwinner while he handled what he vaguely described as investment consulting. Their lifestyle was comfortable but modest. They lived in a cozy 2-bedroom apartment, drove reliable but unremarkable cars, and spent their weekends hiking local trails or trying new restaurants in their neighborhood. The trouble began when Morrison & Associates landed their biggest client yet, Pinnacle Electronics, a tech company looking to rebrand and launch a new product line. The account was worth $3 million, and everyone in the office was buzzing with excitement and ambition. Sarah had been quietly developing ideas for weeks, researching market trends, analyzing competitor strategies, and crafting what she believed was a breakthrough approach to positioning Pinnacle's products. Her immediate supervisor was Jennifer Walsh, a woman who had climbed the corporate ladder more through politics than performance. Jennifer had a talent for taking credit for others' work while deflecting blame when things went wrong. She surrounded herself with a tight circle of allies, including Marcus Chen, the department's golden boy who compensated for mediocre ideas with charm and expensive suits, and Rachel Stevens, whose main qualification seemed to be her ability to agree enthusiastically with whatever Jennifer said. The fourth member of their inner circle was Tony Rodriguez, a creative director who had been with the company for 12 years and felt entitled to lead every major project regardless of who had actually done the work. Together, they formed an impenetrable clique that made decisions over expensive lunches and excluded anyone who threatened their carefully maintained hierarchy. Sarah first realized she was in trouble during a department meeting 3 weeks before the Pinnacle presentation. She had submitted her preliminary research and strategy outline, expecting it to be reviewed and refined by the team. Instead, Jennifer stood at the front of the conference room presenting Sarah's ideas as if they were her own, with Marcus, Rachel, and Tony nodding along approvingly. When Sarah tried to speak up, mentioning that she had additional data that might strengthen their approach, Jennifer cut her off with a dismissive wave. "The junior members of the team handle the research and data collection," Jennifer said smoothly. "The senior team focuses on strategy and client relationships. It's important everyone understands their role in maintaining our professional standards." The message was clear. Sarah could do the work, but she couldn't expect recognition for it. She felt her face flush with embarrassment as her colleagues avoided eye contact, some looking uncomfortable, but none willing to speak up on her behalf. Even worse, she noticed that several of her specific insights and recommendations had been diluted or changed in ways that she knew would make them less effective. Over the following weeks, Sarah watched helplessly as her carefully crafted strategy was gradually dismantled and reassembled by people who didn't understand the research behind it. Marcus insisted on adding flashy visual elements that would distract from the core message. Rachel pushed for celebrity endorsements that would blow half the budget while adding little value. Tony wanted to incorporate trendy design elements that had nothing to do with Pinnacle's target demographic. Every time Sarah tried to raise concerns or suggest alternatives based on her research, she was told she was being negative or that she didn't understand the bigger picture. Jennifer began scheduling planning meetings during times when Sarah had other commitments, then acting surprised when Sarah wasn't up to speed on decisions that had been made in her absence. The situation reached a boiling point 2 weeks before the presentation, when Sarah discovered that her name had been removed entirely from the project team listed in the client proposal. When she confronted Jennifer about it, her supervisor's response was coldly calculated. "Sarah, I think you're having trouble accepting your position here," Jennifer said, closing her office door for privacy. "You're a good researcher, but this project requires senior-level strategic thinking. I can't have team members who aren't on board with our approach undermining the presentation. Maybe it would be better if you focused on some of our smaller accounts until you're ready to be a team player." The threat was unmistakable: fall in line or be pushed out entirely. Sarah left Jennifer's office feeling defeated and invisible, wondering if 8 years of dedication and results meant nothing in the face of office politics and personal ambition. But what hurt most was watching her ideas being corrupted and weakened by people who cared more about looking impressive than being effective. She knew that the strategy they were planning to present would fail, not because the core concept was wrong, but because they had stripped away everything that made it innovative and replaced it with generic corporate speak and flashy but meaningless additions. Sarah tried to focus on her other work, but it was impossible to ignore the constant meetings and planning sessions happening around her. Marcus would walk past her desk talking loudly on his phone about the, quote, game-changing strategy he was developing. Rachel would stage conversations about the incredible creative direction she was bringing to the project. Tony would hold court in the break room, describing the revolutionary approach that was going to make Morrison & Associates the most sought-after firm in the city. The final insult came when Jennifer announced that the entire department would be expected to attend the client presentation to show unity and support for the team. Sarah realized she would have to sit there and watch her own work being presented by people who had not only stolen credit for it, but had also made it worse in the process. She considered calling in sick, but she knew that would only give Jennifer more ammunition to question her commitment to the company. Instead, she decided to attend and try to maintain whatever professional dignity she had left. She chose a simple navy blue dress that made her feel confident without being flashy, and arrived at the office early to prepare herself mentally for what was sure to be a difficult day. The presentation was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the main conference room, with Pinnacle's CEO and marketing team flying in from Portland specifically for the meeting. Morrison & Associates had pulled out all the stops, with catered breakfast, fresh flowers, and their best presentation equipment set up to impress the high-value clients. David had surprised Sarah that morning by saying he wanted to attend the presentation. He rarely showed interest in her work events, preferring to stay in the background of her professional life, but he said he was curious about the project she had been working on so intensively. Sarah was touched by his support, though she warned him it might be boring and that she wouldn't be presenting anything herself. As the conference room filled with people, Sarah found herself relegated to a chair in the back corner, essentially invisible to the clients, and even most of her own colleagues. David sat quietly beside her, observing the room with an intensity she didn't usually see from him. He was dressed simply in khakis and a button-down shirt, looking like exactly what he was, a consultant who worked from home and didn't need to impress anyone with expensive clothes or accessories. Jennifer opened the presentation with her usual confident flair, introducing the team and outlining their approach to repositioning Pinnacle's brand in the competitive electronics market. She spoke eloquently about innovation, market disruption, and revolutionary thinking, using all the buzzwords that sounded impressive but meant very little. When Marcus took over to present the strategy overview, Sarah felt physically sick. He was presenting her research findings as his own discoveries, describing insights she had spent weeks developing as if he had uncovered them himself. But worse than the theft was watching him misinterpret and oversimplify complex market dynamics that required nuanced understanding. Rachel's portion of the presentation focused on creative direction, and Sarah watched in horror as her colleague proposed a visual identity that was trendy but completely wrong for Pinnacle's target demographic. The color schemes were too young, the messaging too casual, and the overall approach felt like it belonged to a lifestyle brand rather than a serious technology company. Tony's section on implementation strategy was the final straw. He had taken Sarah's carefully researched timeline and budget projections and inflated them beyond all reason, apparently believing that bigger numbers would impress the clients more than realistic ones. His proposed budget was nearly double what Sarah knew the project actually required, and his timeline was so aggressive it would guarantee corners being cut and quality suffering. Throughout the presentation, Sarah found herself cringing at missed opportunities and obvious mistakes. The Pinnacle team looked politely interested but not particularly excited, and Sarah could see their CEO taking notes that she suspected were not entirely positive. But the real disaster came during the question and answer session. Pinnacle's marketing director asked a specific question about target demographic analysis, clearly wanting to understand the research behind their proposed approach. Jennifer confidently deferred to Marcus, who stumbled through an answer that made it obvious he didn't understand the data he was supposedly presenting. When Pinnacle's CEO asked about potential challenges and risk mitigation strategies, Tony gave a vague response about their team's experience and adaptability, completely failing to address the specific concerns that Sarah's research had identified and solved. The questions kept coming, each one exposing another gap in the team's understanding of their own presentation. Sarah found herself gripping the arms of her chair, wanting desperately to jump in with the real answers, but knowing it would only make things worse for her professionally. Finally, Pinnacle's CEO asked the question that Sarah had been dreading. He wanted to know about ROI projections and market penetration timelines, specifically how they had calculated their predicted outcomes. This was the heart of Sarah's research, the complex analysis that had taken her weeks to complete and validate. Marcus looked to Jennifer, who looked to Tony, who looked to Rachel. None of them could answer, because none of them had actually done the work. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The silence stretched uncomfortably as four supposedly senior marketing professionals struggled to explain the foundation of their own strategy. That's when Jennifer made the decision that destroyed whatever remaining respect Sarah had for her. Instead of admitting ignorance or deferring the question, Jennifer turned to Sarah in the back of the room and said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Sarah, you helped with some of the data collection. Maybe you can answer Mr. Patterson's question." The phrasing was deliberately demeaning, making it sound like Sarah was a junior assistant rather than the person who had actually developed the entire analytical framework they were presenting. Every eye in the room turned to Sarah, including those of the Pinnacle executives who were clearly wondering why someone qualified to answer their CEO's question was sitting in the back corner like an afterthought. Sarah felt her face burn with humiliation, but she stood up and tried to salvage the situation. She began explaining the ROI calculations and market analysis, speaking clearly and confidently about work she knew better than anyone else in the room. For a moment, she thought she might be able to turn the disaster around, but Jennifer had other plans. As Sarah was mid-sentence, explaining a particularly important data trend, Jennifer interrupted her with a condescending smile. "Thank you, Sarah, but I think we're getting too deep into the weeds here. Our clients don't need to hear about every minor detail of our research process." The dismissal was brutal and public. Sarah was left standing in the middle of the room, cut off mid-explanation, made to look like someone who didn't understand appropriate professional boundaries. She sat down feeling smaller than she had ever felt in her professional life, acutely aware that David was witnessing her complete humiliation. But Jennifer wasn't finished. As if sensing that Sarah was already down and deciding to make sure she stayed there, Jennifer turned back to the Pinnacle executives with an apologetic expression. "I hope you'll forgive us," she said with a laugh that sounded friendly but felt cruel. "Sometimes our research staff gets a little too enthusiastic about sharing every detail of their work. We try to focus on the big picture rather than getting bogged down in the technical minutiae." The implication was clear to everyone in the room. Sarah was overeager, unprofessional, and didn't understand her place in the company hierarchy. Marcus, Rachel, and Tony all chuckled, along with Jennifer's joke, creating a moment of shared amusement at Sarah's expense. Sarah felt tears threatening and fought desperately to maintain her composure. She looked down at her hands, trying to make herself invisible, wishing she could disappear entirely. The presentation continued around her, but she barely heard it over the sound of her own heartbeat and the internal voice telling her that maybe Jennifer was right. Maybe she really was just a research assistant who had gotten too big for her britches. She didn't notice David's expression hardening as he watched the display, or the way his jaw clenched when Jennifer made her dismissive comment. She was too focused on trying not to cry in front of 24 colleagues and clients, too overwhelmed by the public humiliation to pay attention to anything else happening in the room. The presentation limped to its conclusion, with the Pinnacle executives politely thanking the Morrison & Associates team and promising to be in touch soon. Their tone was professional but notably less enthusiastic than it had been at the beginning of the meeting, And Sarah knew that her stolen and mangled strategy had failed to impress the way her original version would have. As people began filing out of the conference room, Sarah remained in her chair, trying to gather the strength to face whatever came next. She knew this incident would be used against her, that Jennifer would probably call her into the office later to discuss her, quote, inappropriate behavior during the client presentation. What she didn't expect was for David to remain seated beside her, his presence solid and comforting, even as her professional world crumbled around her. And what she definitely didn't expect was the conversation she was about to overhear as Jennifer, Marcus, Rachel, and Tony gathered near the door, apparently believing they were speaking quietly enough not to be heard. Well, that was embarrassing, Jennifer said with a harsh laugh. I can't believe Sarah thought she could just take over the presentation like that. Seriously, Marcus agreed. Someone needs to remind her what her job actually is around here. Rachel's voice carried clearly across the room. It's like she doesn't understand that there's a difference between doing research and actually being qualified to present to clients. But it was Tony's comment that cut the deepest. Honestly, I don't know why we keep her around. There are plenty of people who can compile data without causing scenes in important meetings. Sarah felt the last of her composure slip away as she realized that not only had they stolen her work and humiliated her publicly, but they were now rewriting history to make her the villain of their own incompetence. She was about to stand up and leave, to escape before the tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over. That's when David finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying clearly across the suddenly silent conference room. And what he said next would change everything Sarah thought she knew about her husband, her career, and her own worth in ways she never could have imagined. But that moment of revelation, that instant when her quiet life was about to be turned completely upside down, would have to wait. Because sometimes the most important transformations begin not with grand gestures, but with a few simple words spoken by someone who has been watching and waiting for exactly the right moment to act. David stood up slowly, his movement deliberate and controlled. The casual consultant who had been sitting quietly in the back corner suddenly commanded the attention of everyone still lingering in the conference room. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried an authority that Sarah had never heard before. "Excuse me," he said, addressing the group near the door. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about my wife." Jennifer turned around with a patronizing smile, clearly prepared to dismiss this unknown husband as easily as she had dismissed Sarah. "Oh, you must be Sarah's husband. I'm sorry you had to witness that little outburst." Sometimes emotions run high in professional settings. David's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. "My name is David Chen," he said calmly, "and I think there's been a significant misunderstanding here." Sarah looked up at her husband in confusion. Chen wasn't his last name. They had been married for 5 years, and his name was David Morrison, wasn't it? Suddenly, she realized how little she actually knew about her husband's work, his background, his family. He had always been vague about his consulting business, always deflected questions about his clients or his projects. Marcus stepped forward with his usual arrogant confidence. "Look, Mr. Morrison, or whatever your name is, this is really an internal company matter. Maybe you should take your wife home so she can calm down." David smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "Actually, I think I'll stay. You see, I've been watching this presentation with great interest, particularly because Pinnacle Electronics is one of my companies." The room went completely silent. Jennifer's patronizing smile faltered, and Marcus took an involuntary step backward. Rachel and Tony exchanged confused glances, clearly not understanding what they had just heard. "I'm sorry," Jennifer said, her voice less certain than before. "Did you say one of your companies?" "Pinnacle Electronics," David repeated patiently. "Along with about 30 others. I'm the founder and CEO of Chen Industries. Perhaps you've heard of us." Sarah felt the world tilt around her. Chen Industries was one of the largest private investment firms on the West Coast. She had read about them in business magazines, seen their CEO mentioned in Forbes articles about young billionaires who preferred to stay out of the spotlight. But that CEO was named David Chen, and her husband was David Morrison, the quiet freelance consultant who worked from their spare bedroom, except apparently he wasn't. "You're lying," Tony said, but his voice lacked conviction. "David Chen is some reclusive billionaire. He doesn't just show up at marketing presentations." David pulled out his phone and made a quick call. Patricia? Yes, it's David. Can you patch me through to James Patterson at Pinnacle? He should still be in the building. He paused, listening. Perfect. Within seconds, David's phone rang. He answered it on speaker, and James Patterson's voice filled the silent conference room. David, I was just about to call you. We finished the Morrison presentation, and honestly, I'm not impressed. The strategy seems sound at its core, but the team couldn't answer basic questions about their own research. About that, David said, his eyes never leaving Jennifer's increasingly pale face. I think there might have been some miscommunication about who actually developed that strategy. What do you mean? The woman who answered your ROI question, the one sitting in the back? She's the one who did all the research and analysis. The people presenting were just reading from her work. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Are you serious? We were told she was just a research assistant. She's my wife, David said simply. And she's the most brilliant strategic mind I've ever encountered. I've been watching her work for years, hoping she'd eventually realize her own worth and start her own firm. Sarah stared at her husband in shock. Everything she thought she knew about her life was shifting and realigning. The modest lifestyle, the quiet demeanor, the way he always seemed content to let her be the primary breadwinner, it had all been an elaborate facade to hide the fact that he was worth billions of dollars. Patterson's voice came through the speaker again. Well, this certainly changes things. David, can you have your wife call me directly? I'd like to discuss offering her a consulting contract, bypassing Morrison entirely. I'll have her reach out this afternoon, David said. But first, I think we need to address some other business matters. He ended the call and looked around the room at the four people who had spent the morning humiliating his wife. Now, let's talk about Morrison and Associates. You see, I've been considering acquiring a marketing firm to handle campaigns for my various companies. I was actually thinking Morrison might be a good fit. Jennifer's eyes lit up with desperate hope. Mr. Chen, I think there might have been a misunderstanding about today's presentation. Sarah is a valued member of our team, and we certainly didn't mean to imply otherwise. Oh, but you did, David said softly. I heard every word. You called her work minor details and, quote, technical minutiae. You dismissed her expertise as inappropriate enthusiasm. And then, when you thought no one was listening, you suggested she should be fired. Marcus tried to salvage the situation. Look, there might have been some miscommunication, but we all recognize Sarah's contributions to the team. Really? David's voice was dangerously quiet. Because from where I was sitting, it looked like you stole her work, presented it as your own, mangled it beyond recognition, and then humiliated her when she tried to salvage your incompetent presentation. He walked over to Sarah, who was still sitting in stunned silence, and offered her his hand. Sweetheart, I think it's time we left. You have a phone call to make to Mr. Patterson, and I have some business decisions to finalize. Sarah took his hand and stood up, her mind reeling with questions, but her body moving automatically. As they headed toward the door, David turned back to address the room one final time. Oh, and Jennifer, I've decided not to acquire Morrison & Associates after all. Instead, I think I'll buy your biggest competitor. What's the name of that firm downtown? Sterling Creative Solutions? Yes, I think they'll make an excellent addition to my portfolio. Jennifer's face went white. Sterling Creative was Morrison's primary rival, the firm they competed with for every major client in the city. If David Chen bought Sterling and gave them his business, Morrison would lose half their accounts within 6 months. Mr. Chen, please, Jennifer started, but David was already walking away. In the elevator, Sarah finally found her voice. David, what just happened up there? Who are you? What's going on? David smiled, and for the first time, she saw him clearly. The quiet confidence wasn't the contentment of a small-time consultant. It was the assurance of a man who could buy and sell companies on a whim. The simple clothes weren't about lacking resources. They were about not needing to prove anything to anyone. I'm your husband, he said simply. I'm the man who has watched you brilliantly solve business problems for 8 years, while being consistently undervalued and overlooked. I'm the man who has been waiting for you to realize that you don't need Morrison & Associates. They need you. But why didn't you tell me? About the money? About your company? David's expression grew serious. Because I wanted you to love me for who I am, not what I have. And I wanted you to discover your own worth, not have it handed to you because of who you married. You're brilliant, Sarah. You always have been. You just needed to see it for yourself. The elevator doors opened in the parking garage, and David led her to a car she'd never seen before. Not their usual sedan, but a sleek black Tesla that probably cost more than her annual salary. "Is this yours too?" she asked weakly. "Ours," he corrected. "Everything I have is ours. The house in Bellevue, the cabin in Aspen, the apartment in New York. I've been waiting 5 years for you to be ready to share that life with me." As they drove through downtown Seattle, David explained how he had built Chen Industries from a small tech startup into a billion-dollar investment firm. How he had met Sarah at a coffee shop near her old apartment and fallen in love with her intelligence and kindness. How he had created an elaborate cover story about freelance consulting to hide his wealth until she was ready to handle the truth. "I've been routing contracts through shell companies, working under false names, doing everything I could to make my cover story believable," he said. "Patricia, my assistant, has been helping coordinate everything. She's the one who's been taking my calls when you thought I was working from home." Sarah's head was spinning. "So when you said you were working on investment projects, I was running a multi-billion-dollar company from our spare bedroom," David confirmed. "It wasn't ideal from a productivity standpoint, but it was worth it to come home to you every night." They pulled into the driveway of a house Sarah had never seen before. Not their modest apartment, but a stunning modern home overlooking Elliott Bay with floor-to-ceiling windows and a 3-car garage. "Welcome home," David said softly. Inside, the house was furnished with expensive but tasteful pieces that somehow felt like home immediately. Sarah wandered through rooms that were clearly designed for her comfort, with built-in bookshelves, a home office with 2 desks, and a kitchen that was every amateur cook's dream. "You bought this for us?" she asked. "I bought it for you," David corrected. 3 years ago. I've been having it maintained and updated, waiting for the right moment to surprise you with it." Sarah sank into a leather chair that probably cost more than she made in a month. "Why now? Why today?" David sat across from her, his expression serious. "Because I couldn't watch them destroy you anymore. I've been hoping you'd quit Morrison for years, start your own firm, realize that you're worth 10 of Jennifer Walsh. But today, when I watched them steal your work and then humiliate you for trying to salvage their incompetence, I knew I had to act." "So you're really going to buy Sterling Creative?" "I already did," David said matter-of-factly. "I made the call during the elevator ride. The paperwork should be finalized by tomorrow morning." Sarah stared at him. "You bought an entire company in an elevator?" "I bought an entire company to give my wife the career she deserves," David corrected. "Sterling's current leadership will be offered generous severance packages. You'll be taking over as CEO with complete autonomy to hire your own team and run the company however you see fit." The magnitude of what was happening finally hit Sarah. In the span of 2 hours, she had gone from being a humiliated research assistant to being the CEO of one of Seattle's premier marketing firms. Her quiet husband had revealed himself to be a billionaire who commanded enough power to reshape entire industries with a phone call. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she said quietly. David moved to sit beside her, taking her hands in his. "You've been ready for years. You just needed the opportunity to prove it to yourself, and now you have it." Over the following weeks, Sarah began to understand the true scope of her husband's influence and wealth. Chen Industries owns stakes in dozens of companies across multiple industries. David's personal net worth was estimated at over $3 billion, making him one of the youngest billionaires in the country, despite his preference for staying out of the public eye. But more importantly, she began to understand her own capabilities when freed from the toxic environment at Morrison & Associates. With David's resources behind her and complete creative control, Sarah transformed Sterling Creative into the most innovative marketing firm on the West Coast within 6 months. She hired talented people who had been overlooked by traditional firms, created profit-sharing programs that rewarded actual performance rather than office politics, and developed strategies that consistently outperformed anything Morrison & Associates could produce. The Pinnacle Electronics campaign, rebuilt from the ground up using Sarah's original research, became a case study taught in business schools across the country. Other major clients followed, drawn by Sterling's reputation for delivering results rather than just impressive presentations. Meanwhile, Morrison and Associates struggled to survive without Sarah's behind-the-scenes contributions. Jennifer, Marcus, Rachel, and Tony found themselves unable to replicate the quality of work they had been taking credit for. Within a year, the firm had lost 3 major clients and was forced to lay off half their staff. Jennifer Walsh eventually reached out to Sarah, ostensibly to apologize but really to ask for a job. Sarah declined politely but firmly, explaining that Sterling Creative had a strict policy against hiring people who had demonstrated poor character in their previous positions. Sarah never took pleasure in Morrison's downfall, but she did take satisfaction in proving that talent and hard work ultimately mattered more than office politics and theft. She had built something genuine and lasting, surrounded by people who valued her ideas rather than stealing them. The most surprising part of her new life wasn't the wealth or the success, but the confidence that came with finally being seen and valued for who she really was. David had given her the opportunity, but Sarah had seized it and made it her own. Years later, when asked about the secret to Sterling Creative's success, Sarah would always give the same answer. She had learned that your worth isn't determined by how others treat you, but by how you treat yourself and others. And sometimes, when you're at your lowest point, life provides exactly what you need to remember who you really are. The quiet woman who had been mocked and dismissed had become one of the most respected voices in her industry. Not because of who she married, but because of who she had always been, underneath the years of being undervalued and overlooked. And David, watching his wife thrive in the career she had always deserved, knew that his patience and faith in her had been rewarded beyond anything money could buy. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.